Tipp FM on your wavelength. We are Tipp FM.
Real people.
Real fun.
Real music.
Very sad case, really.
There was nothing but a certain amount of circumstantial evidence against her.
But he got a report of maybe 4 lines.
I don't know. Now, this is the mystery.
Later, it appears that her 3-month-old child was brought to her in the prison.
I've no knowledge of it, and I would imagine that if he had it, he would have spoken about it.
If we knew exactly what year he had been brought in.
And I think it would be very interesting, what did happen to the family.
It's very hard to track people down there because of the lack of headstones that are down there at the moment.
Between the years 1800 to 1868, at least 42 women who had been found guilty of capital offences in Ireland were taken to places of public execution and hanged in front of large crowds. 4 of these women happened to be executed in County Tipperary, the last being Margaret Gunning from Templemore, who in 1832 had the unfortunate distinction of being the last woman publicly, or indeed privately, executed in the county. This documentary is an attempt to piece together the forgotten story of Margaret Gunning from Templemore, about whom almost nothing is known, and information concerning her trial and personal life is very thin on the ground. I came across her story through the work of historian Danny Grace in Nina. So what do we know? First of all, about the crime and subsequent trial.
It was actually, the crime was the murder of James Short. Now, James Short is 20 years of age, and he was murdered during the night of Wednesday, the 11th of January, 1832, at a place called Morrison's Grove. Now, Templemore people might know where that is. A short distance outside the town of Templemore.
John Walsh lives in Main Street, Templemore, and is a member of the local historical society.
Morrison's Grove, you can see on the Ordnance Survey map, there's a sheet 29/10 that covers Templemore. And the road going from Templemore town to Borsalee, about 1.5 miles going towards Borsalee, on the left-hand side there's an area on the map called Morrison's Grove. It might be Morrison's Grove.
The motive is a bit dubious, a bit doubtful. It's difficult actually to see what exactly, but there seems to have been a difference of opinion, a feud you'd almost say, between young Short and the Gunnings. Now, we do know that Short, actually, he was 20 years of age. He had been an apprentice with the Gunnings, an apprentice brazier. And he had left, obviously, for some reason, and he was now working, at the time he was murdered, with a man called Akers in Templemore. I suspect, actually, again, I have no real proof, that he left in pretty strange circumstances, that all was not well between himself and the Gunnings, and that was the reasons for the beginning of the difference between them.
This difference between James Short and the Gunnings must have been common knowledge locally, because within hours of the body being discovered on Wednesday, January 11th, 1832, police apprehended both Margaret Gunning, there was no mention of her husband, and a 20-year-old named James Cormac, who visited her house regularly on suspicion of involvement in the murder. He was arrested at a place called the Washpen.
Yeah, the Washpen is a name given to Castellini, and Castellini village is northeast of Templemore, be about 1.5 miles from the town. It's a village in which there is a church and a school and a shop and a range of houses around it.
But why should James Cormac, who was described as a labouring boy and a plain country lad in the press, be arrested?
The row was between the Gunnings and Short, and that Cormac seemed to be related to Mrs. Gunning. And, at the time, I suppose, family loyalty seemed to be a very, very important thing. And it may be an example of somebody literally taking up the cudgels on behalf of their relations. So that's the only explanation I can offer.
James Short had died as a result of a deep wound over his temple, and the following day, Thursday, January 12th, 1832, an inquest was held on the body in Templemore, where it appeared that the evening before the murder, James Cormac had been heard saying that he would take Short's life, and that Margaret Gunning had requested one of her husband's apprentices to fill a large stick with 3 pounds of molten lead, and that this was the supposed murder weapon. James Cormac, it appeared, had also arisen early on the morning of the murder, had been absent for some time and returned to bed again. The jury found a verdict of willful murder against Margaret Gunning and James Cormac, and both were removed to Clonmel Jail the following day, Friday, January 13th, 1832, under a military escort from the 74th Regiment of Foot.
Yeah, that regiment was in Templemore, Templemore Barracks was where the Garda College is located now. Garda moved there in 1964 and it was completely revamped about 15 years ago.
Two months after the murder, the trial of James Cormac and Margaret Gunning opened at Clonmel Assizes, the equivalent of a circuit court today, on Friday, March 16, 1832. Local historian Dr. Michael Ahern is a native of the town and author of the book Clonmel County Jail.
Well, the trial took place in the Clonmel Courthouse, which is in Nelson Street. Lovely sandstone building. The facade is very like Leinster House, and it was built roughly in 1800.
They were represented by Hetchel, who was a very, very well-known defence attorney, and I'd say, in fairness, a man who got many a defendant off, but not in this particular case.
And I think there were 7 witnesses for the prosecution in total, wasn't there? There
was 7 witnesses, but very few of them offering any real concrete evidence. That's the point of view.
The most damning evidence against Margaret Gunning and James Cormac came from 20-year-old Michael Greatrix from County Limerick, who at the time of James Short's murder had been living with the Gunnings a fortnight and worked as a journeyman brazier, i.e. someone who worked with copper, tin or brass, with her husband. He had only arrived in Templemore from Mount Rat 2 weeks prior. He testified that on the night before the murder, he had been in MacDonald's public house in Templemore with James Cormac, who also planned to stay the night in Gunnings.
And on their way home, they saw Short outside, and Cormac immediately picked up a number of stones and threw them at him. He seemed to have something in for him. So when they had got home, about half an hour later, stones were thrown through the windows of Gunning's shop, breaking eight panes of glass. So now immediately it was suspected that Short was the perpetrator, and Cormac, armed with a stick, ran out shouting for his blood, literally. He actually went to the house where he lived. He lived with his father, Short, and he tried to beat down the door. So obviously there was bad blood between the Gunnings, Cormac and Short.
Michael Greatrix also gave damning evidence against Margaret Gunning in relation to the stick that Cormac had allegedly been armed with that night.
Now, he claimed that a few days previously, Mrs. Gunning instructed him, that's Greatrix, to actually fill it with lead and to put a tin ferrule, I think they called it, on the top of it. And she herself then drove 2 nails into it as well. Of course, this was to give it added weight, and if you got a stroke of this, you certainly were going to know all about it. So that was part of the circumstantial evidence, of course, against both Cormac and as well as that against Mrs. Gunning, that she was the one who prepared the murder weapon.
Shane Kilcummins is Professor of Law at UCC.
One other thread I think that kind of is useful to point out in this period is that violence in Ireland in the 19th century was absolutely much more prevalent. And so, we had a lot of faction fighting back in the 19th century. We had a lot of use of cudgels and sticks. And we see in this case itself that it was a stick that was with molten lead that was being used. So open displays of aggression were I suppose were much more conspicuous, and they were more tolerated in the 19th century. And this violence, it usually was tied up with alcoholism. It was tied up with faction fights and neighbourhoods and disputes over land. It would be kind of disputes in the workplace, but very, very prevalent. And I suppose the John Milton Synge's Playboy of the Western World captured to some extent the essence of that violence that used to take place in the faction fighting and the use of sticks and cudgels and so on.
In fact, during the trial, one of the later witnesses was asked if the murder victim, James Short, had been involved in a riot as a member of either the Cummins or Darrig factions which existed in Templemore. The witness said he didn't know, but never saw him engaged in any conflict with them. Michael Greatrix continued on that he had seen Cormac holding the stick loaded with lead shortly after it had been prepared and proclaimed his desire to give Short the benefit of it. Greatrix also stated that on the night of the murder he had gone to bed about 10 p.m. at Mrs. Gunning's request, leaving her and Cormac, who had returned from his attack on Short's house, sitting together at the fire. He said that he heard Cormac say he would have Short's life that night, but Mrs. Gunning desired him not to do it, as he would be strongly suspected as he slept in her house. Greatrix said Cormac went to bed in the loft beside him later, but got up during the night for a few hours and didn't return to bed until after 7 a.m. Shortly afterwards, Mrs. Gunning shouted up to them that Short is killed stone dead. On hearing it, Cormac got up and danced on the floor. Greatrix remembered seeing the stick loaded with lead placed amongst some turf. Cormac then went out, while Mrs. Gunning took up the stick, exclaiming that there would be a search for it.
Now, the interesting thing is, of course, that the murder weapon, if it was the murder weapon, was never discovered. The police came and they searched Gunning's, but they weren't able to find it. Now, according to Greatrix again, because again you can't get away from him because he was the key witness, he claimed actually that it had been hidden by Mrs. Gunning.
Her husband worked as a brazier. I think that's the guy who works with copper or brass. I mean, could he possibly have been making weapons for those guys in the faction fights?
They usually were weapons that were being adapted, and so it's very hard to know whether he actually was or he wasn't. It's possibly unlikely. It was more likely that people who were going to be involved in the faction fights would be making them themselves. But that those faction fights were very, very prevalent, and actually to some extent were tolerated, not just by society but also by the legal system as well. The adaptation of weapons was not in and of itself unusual.
It seems that in his evidence, Michael Greatrix certainly made no effort to deflect attention away from his recent friend James Cormac, or the wife of his then employer, Margaret Gunning. We can't be sure if he was telling the truth or lying, but perhaps he had a reason to, as it were, deflect the spotlight onto them, having also been arrested himself the morning after the murder and placed in the bridewell for a time.
Now, of course, he was there when certain of this plotting, if we want to call it that, was taking place as well. So he actually was taken in on suspicion. So naturally enough, pressure probably was put on him then, because he could actually have been charged perhaps as being an accessory as well, you see. So I'd say he was an element of, as it were, trying to save himself maybe as well in giving evidence.
2 soldiers of the 74th Regiment of Foot, named Deacon and McLean, who had been on sentry duty at Templemore Barracks, also gave evidence against Margaret Gunning during the trial.
They actually claimed that they saw Mrs. Gunning passing by shortly before 7 o'clock on the morning of the murder. They also claimed that shortly afterwards they heard loud cries and loud groans as if somebody was being attacked. Now, the question arises, of course, number one, would they have known Mrs. Gunning that well? Would they have been in a position to recognise her? But their evidence doesn't seem to have been contradicted all that much.
The other witnesses for the prosecution included Thomas Hillard, who said he had heard James Cormac say he would have Short's life after the stones had been thrown, and Mrs. Gunning also exclaimed profanities. Interestingly though, he saw no stick or weapon in Cormac's hand as he ran towards Short's house. James Scanlon was cross-examined about his discovery of the body of James Short, Dr. George Bradshaw on his examination of it, and Sergeant Patrick Morgan on the futile search he had conducted for the supposed murder weapon in Gunning's house, where Margaret had denied any knowledge of it and told him to find it how he might. There was only one witness for the defence.
And Mary Farrell claimed that she visited the Gunning house between 6 and 7 that morning and found Mrs. Gunning at home and only partially dressed, which suggested she just got up out of bed. So, as I say, the evidence was very, very circumstantial against her.
Mary Farrell also testified that she had seen Cormac and Greatrix coming down from the loft that morning. On leaving the Gunning house, she learned of the murder of James Short and decided immediately to return to surprise Margaret with the news. When she called at 8 a.m, Mrs. Gunning was clearly hearing it for the first time in her view and was greatly affected, full of tears. Mary Farrell was the last person to give evidence. It's worth noting that the trial of Margaret Gunning and James Cormac for the murder of James Short which was held on Friday, March 16th, 1832 in Clonmel, lasted only one sitting.
They were basically landowners and that sort of thing. You know, the grand jury would have been made up of important landowners throughout the county.
Well, actually, and again, I suppose one of the things that was crucial in that period as well is for most of the 18th century and the early 19th century, juries were local. And they were actually, you know, very often they were picked on the basis that they had local knowledge. And the phrase is often used in that it's called manifest criminality, so that the local knowledge they brought to bear was incredibly important. And of course, today one of the big differences would be if you were local, you would not be permitted to actually sit on a jury trial because it could possibly prejudice you.
Interestingly, we learn in this trial a juror being objected to on the part of the prisoners as living in the neighbourhood was replaced by another gentleman in the jury box.
The evidence was heard, the 7 witnesses were produced, and then the jury left to make their verdict, and they returned actually within 30 minutes, and both Mrs. Gunning and James Cormack were found guilty. By the way, I should say that Mrs. Gunning was found guilty of conspiracy to murder, not murder itself.
This made no difference, and both James Cormack and Margaret Gunning were sentenced to hang. This would be carried out some 3 weeks after their trial.
Yes, juries, they made their decisions quickly, but I think that was actually also part of a much speedier trial process. Trials back then were hasty affairs. They occurred very, very quickly, and you know, the idea that from commission of the crime to execution would be less than 6 months would be unheard of today. That it would be a much more long drawn out affair, take a lot longer to get before the court. There would also be the possibility of appeals, and so you'll be talking about a period of 2 to 3 years, and the trial itself would be much longer, and you would not expect a jury to come back within 30 minutes. It would be very, very unusual.
Both of them protested their innocence, right to the very, very end. Now, they had got what you would call the long day, an interesting one, because you often find in these court cases that when the defendant had been sentenced to death, he then pleaded with the judge, "My lord, give us the long day." Now, what the long day was, to put off the date of execution as far as possible as the law allowed. Of 3 weeks was about the outset. Of course, there was a reason for that. The obvious one was that you'd be alive for another 3 weeks. But as well as that, it gave your friends and well-wishers a chance to forward a petition to the Lord Lieutenant in Dublin looking for clemency. And that, by the way, was done in the case of Margaret Gunning as well, but it didn't yield any results though. The Lord Lieutenant could commute it to transportation for life. That was the usual thing, but it didn't actually happen in this particular case.
Both Margaret Gunning and James Cormack remained in Clonmel County Jail until their execution, some of which survives today. Dr. Michael Ahern again.
All that's left is the main gate, that's all. And they would have been executed outside the main gate. Well, it was a county jail, first of all, so it would have housed all the criminals, we say, in the county, male and female. It was built to house roughly 100 to 200 prisoners, but at times there would have been in excess of 300 prisoners in the place. It fluctuated.
And when she was in jail, she would have been accommodated with women, wouldn't she? She wouldn't have been in with fellas or...
Oh, no, she would have been in a cell on her own, actually. She would have been allowed visitors, of course,
I suppose it's hard to know, but we can assume the likes of Margaret Gunning, she'd have been watched to make sure she didn't commit suicide, I suppose.
Yes, she would, and there would have been people with her. So when from the time that you were, basically on death row, there would have been people with you all the time, and she would certainly have been watched.
Margaret Gunning and James Cormack were due to be hanged on Saturday, April 14th, 1832, outside of Clonmel County Jail.
For the want of a better word, actually, hangings in those days were like circuses. They were a big public event, and the town would be thronged with people for the day. You'd have all sorts of people in there, between pickpockets and prostitutes, and even the gentry would be there. There'd be hundreds of people actually gathered outside of the prison. They would be there. Some of them would treated very lightly, because a lot of them would, in the course of the day, would be pretty drunk and that sort of thing. Just came to use a common term, for the crack, believe it or not.
And it was free to turn up?
Oh, absolutely. They were out in the main street, looking at it. On the scaffold would be erected for the occasion, and of course when the hanging was over, it would have been dismantled. And on the scaffold, you would have had the governor, of course, of the jail, the priest or the vicar, as depending on the denomination of the person in question. Of course, the hangman, needless to say, and maybe one or two soldiers. And so the scaffold, of course, would always be surrounded by the military and the constabulary, just in case there was any incident, we'll say.
However, although Gunning and Cormac were due to be hanged on the same day, things didn't quite turn out that way, as Danny Grace explains.
James Cormac actually was hanged on the 14th of April 1832, protesting his innocence even on the scaffold. Now, Margaret Gunning then protested that she was pregnant. So the normal thing in that course of event was that the sentence of execution was put off, not fully put off, until the pregnancy had come to full term and the child had been born, and then the woman was executed. Now, as it turned out, actually, she wasn't pregnant, because it was discovered after a short time that she actually had a child 3 months previous to the murder. And what happened then was that the child actually, I think his name was James, according to the baptismal register, his name seems to have been James. The 3-month-old child was brought into prison then, and she was allowed to keep the child until a few days before her execution, which, you know, just two ways of looking at it. In one way, it might seem a rather humane thing to do, but on the other hand, it seemed a very, very cruel thing to do, in a sense, you know, that a woman who's going to be executed should actually have care of the child for a few weeks, really.
Would that have been a common ploy amongst women who were going to be executed?
Yeah, there was two very often there was two types of kind of pardons that was used. One is called the benefit of clergy, and so if a person could read a particular passage from the Bible, they may be able to argue for that. And they used to have, actually, in the court, they'd have fun at the time, that very often people couldn't read, but they'd learn off the relevant passage, and then in court they'd have fun with them. They'd turn the Bible upside down, and the person wouldn't know, and they'd still they'd have it learnt off, and they'd kind of speak it in kind of rote format, not knowing that the Bible had been turned upside down. And the other one that was often pleaded for was the benefit of the belly, they called it. And this was the idea that if you were pregnant, that you could again have your sentence, you could be pardoned. Now, again, it was unclear. There seemed to be a feeling that she was pregnant at the time, that the sentence had been handed down, but then later it appears that her 3-month-old child was brought to her in the prison before execution. So she may have, that possibility may have been opened up to her, but then clearly the child had already been born, so it was closed off again. They were not overly strict as to whether somebody was pregnant or not. It was not, that if it was pleaded, they may permit it. But again, it just shows you the kind of the discretionary nature of the justice system that existed back then.
Finally, Margaret Gunning did meet her maker on Friday, June 1st, 1832, shortly after 1 o'clock in Clonmel.
Oh, she would have been hanged where the outside the jail, outside the main gate of the jail, actually. That's where she would have been hanged.
And what's the current address of the jail then?
Emmett Street. And there's a mill there called Richmond Mill. It's now a significant landmark, in the town.
She spoke on the scaffold, very, very dignified. She seemed to have become reconciled to her faith at that stage, spoke very dignified, really sort of asked that her children and would be looked after, and her husband, would be, and forgive her enemies, really, I suppose, those who put her in the situation she was in, and asked for forgiveness, even though, of course, she protested her innocence, that she had neither really hand, act or part in the murder of Charlotte.
Is it likely that her children would have been looking on? Like, children would have been allowed to look at executions?
Absolutely, yeah. There was no distinctions were made. I mean, when the public came along to look at the execution, there was no regulation as to, it was basically a mob, and whoever wanted to come along was fine, and the more the merrier. This is the idea. The public visibility was incredibly important, and it was the intensity of the event that's how you conveyed a moral message.
And what would have happened to the bodies then of the people who were hanged?
Yeah, well, up to 1832, they were all brought to the infirmary in Cashel for the purposes of dissection. And of course, it was another really insult to the dead. It was a kind of a degradation. For a while then, for 2 years actually, that in 1832 legislation changed, and that case that you mentioned, Gunning, she was allowed to be buried at home because they had dispensed with that legislation. But 2 years later, they reintroduced it again. And when they were finished dissecting the body, it was generally brought back to Clonmel and buried in the prison grounds.
And hers was the last public execution of a woman in County Tipperary?
Well, the last one that I know of anyhow. In fact, there was a list published of executions that took part in Clonmel, and she's not mentioned in that list, so you're just wondering how comprehensive the list was in the first place. But after 1868, actually, it was decided that people were getting a little more enlightened in certain respects, and they felt that the idea of public executions was rather ghoulish and that sort of thing, and unbecoming. And from that date onwards, there were executions within the prison grounds. There were no more public hangings as such.
In a nutshell, they are the particulars of the alleged crime, trial and punishment of Templemore woman Margaret Gunning. But how was the case covered in the press of 1832? Mary Guinan Dermody is the local studies librarian with Tipperary Libraries in Thurles.
First, I checked the Irish Newspaper Archive, which will give access to some national and local papers online. It wasn't covered in the national papers at all. Then I went to the microfilms because we hold microfilms of all the Tipperary papers. So it was covered in the Advertiser, the Clonmel Advertiser, the Clonmel Herald and the Tipperary Free Press. All three are published in Clonmel. There must have been a few different journalists because the articles do vary from paper to paper, as do the accounts of the execution as well. The trial itself made the front page in all of the papers. The rule of court, where you would get the actual sentencing, didn't. It came maybe in page 2 or 3, as did the reports of the executions. The first report of the actual crime was in the Limerick Chronicle, and then it was repeated in one of the local papers, I think it was the Herald, and that it was reported verbatim from the Limerick Chronicle of the time in January 1832.
What did the papers have to say about the day she was executed?
Her execution was in the Tipperary Free Press and in the Advertiser, and she got about 11 lines in the Tip Free Press, a smaller account in the other paper, and it spoke about how she proclaimed her innocence even to the very, very end, and that she was very, very upset. And she also asked the priest to have the executioner go easy on her and be gentle with her. So it was a very, very upsetting experience. I mean, they went into the reports of the trial in great detail, but I don't know, was it that they didn't like the fact that a woman was executed and that they thought people might feel it was upsetting or something that the reports were so short, But when she was being tried, they spoke about her being a harsh-looking woman, as though she was maybe aggressive or awkward or something like that, whereas in the report of her execution they said she was a handsome woman and that she was not quite middle-aged, but it sounded as though maybe she was late 30s, early 40s. But then I suppose people aged more at that period as well.
Oh yeah, does it say much about James Cormac, by the way?
The report of James's execution was much shorter, just that he was executed, but that he also, as said, he was innocent even up to the very, very end. But he got a report of maybe 4 lines, whereas Margaret got a much bigger report altogether.
And does it say anything about the guy who was killed short? Does it say anything about him or his family in any of them? Or?
No, it says very, very little, just that he was a neighbour of Margaret Gunning and that he had worked with them on occasions and that he lived, maybe a few yards away from the Gunning household. And even in one of the reports it said that, they can't even be sure that it was Short that broke the window in the Gunning household, which seems to have given rise to this crime in the first place.
In fact, it emerged during the trial that the deceased had been standing at the corner of Gunning's house with 2 boys, so it could have been one of them that broke the windows.
You see, recording the reports of these executions and that sort of thing only started roughly in the 1830s. Before that, they would just record the fact in the newspaper that so-and-so had been hanged. That's all. After that, then the papers actually decided to report on them. But they kind of they followed a certain format. They would just announce what the reasons for them being hanged. They would give a little bit of detail about the execution itself, and maybe what happened to the body. But that's all, actually.
So what did actually happen to the body of Margaret Gunning? As mentioned by Dr. Michael Ahern earlier, she was allowed to be buried at home. But where? There's no specific cemetery mentioned in the papers, and the church record doesn't exist. The Tipperary Free Press says that after hanging for the usual time, which could have been for up to an hour, her body was given to friends. Danny Grace again.
The funeral, it did go back to Templemore, and indeed the newspaper noted that there was a very, very large concourse of people accompanying the funeral back to Templemore. But where she was buried, now whether she was buried in Templemore or an adjoining graveyard or where, I honestly don't know.
Although there is no church burial record for Margaret, I've managed to unearth several others to feature later, which confirm that she was a Roman Catholic. Professor Shane Kilcummins again.
You know, it's more of maybe perhaps a canon law issue, but my understanding was there would be no problem being buried on consecrated ground for somebody who was executed. I don't think that would have been a difficulty per se. The real issue was, would you get the body back to be able to bury them in that way?
Ronan Loughnane is a member of the Historical Society in Templemore.
Well, there are 3 graveyards in town now. The oldest graveyard is out in the park at the old church, but she's more than likely to be buried in the graveyard adjoining the church grounds, more than likely down towards the bottom end of the graveyard. But there are very few stones down there at the moment now, which is probably the reason that they can't find one with the Gunning name on it.
And there would have been burials in that place dating back to before 1832, yeah?
Yes, there would have been burials down there, yeah. But as I say, it's the oldest part of the graveyard in the town at the moment, so it's very hard to track people down there because of the lack of headstones that are down there at the moment.
Is it possible that she wasn't buried in holy ground, shall we say? Is that possible?
Very unlikely, I'd say she was buried in a church. But you see, most people then, and her circumstances, I'd say they were quite poor. There was only she young children and that. And they more than likely didn't have the money to erect a headstone. That would be common enough, you know.
Incidentally, we're also none the wiser as to exactly where James Short and James Cormack were buried. Now I want to try and discover a bit about Margaret Gunning, the woman, and then her family. For example, was she actually born in Templemore or did she move there? Where exactly in the town did she live? Who was her husband and what did his occupation as a brazier entail? How many children did she have and what became of them all after she was gone in 1832? Let's start with what we can determine from the archive material available.
We know a little about her. In fact, you know, even though the court case was pretty extensively reported, there wasn't a terrible lot of information, but from the actual court reports and from a number of other sources, I pieced together at least a little bit about her. Now, she actually was a married woman. She seemed to be in her 30s.
It also mentions that she had 4 children, the youngest being the baby that was brought to her in the prison. And it also mentions somewhere else about other children, that she may have had 7 children, but it seems that there were only 4 living. It also mentions her mother, so it seems that the mother was living in the house with them.
Her husband, by the way, it was either Edward or Edmund, and he was a brazier. Now, what's a brazier, you might say, because it's not something that we come across too often nowadays. Really a man that worked with brass or copper. I suppose a type of a plumber in a sense, that's what he was. And in fact, interestingly, in 1850, he was described actually as a plumber and glazier. Now, his address in 1850, I presume it was the same in 1832, was given as number 49 Jail Street in Templemore.
So where exactly in Templemore is Jail Street? And is it known by that name today? John Walsh again.
Jail Street is Bank Street, and the town hall is in the centre of Templemore, and directly going from the town hall down to the railway station is about a distance of a mile. And when you start to go down from the town hall, that's Bank Street, and that was originally Jail Street.
And I presume they would have been reasonably comfortably off. They wouldn't be terribly rich people, but at the same time, they would be far from being poor. And they certainly had at least one person working with them.
And was she from Templemore herself, or did she move
I don't know. Now, this is the mystery. Unfortunately, at no stage was her maiden name mentioned, and I would love to have actually known what her maiden name was, but no, that's never mentioned. So I don't know what she from Templemore. In fact, to be honest about it is, I can't even say that the Gunnings were native of Templemore. And interestingly, I gave a talk there about 6 months ago, and there were quite a number of quite elderly people in the audience, and at the end of the talk I asked them, did anybody ever hear of a Gunning family? And nobody had ever heard of them, a Gunning family in Templemore, which might suggest, now as I say, even after her execution, the family were there still in 1850, but how long they remained on afterwards, I don't know.
And there's a book called The History of Templemore, and that was written by my father, Paul Walsh.
Had you, or do you think your father ever heard of the Margaret Gunning story before, do you think?
I've no knowledge of it, and I would imagine that if he had it, he would have spoken about it, but I've never heard him speak about it yet.
And we've no idea about the kids in later years, what happened to them?
We don't, and I think it would be very interesting, what did happen to the family, and there may well be relatives alive. I think there were Gunnings in Thurles afterwards. Now, whether they're the same Gunnings or not, I don't know.
And to your knowledge, is there any Gunnings in the town since then or now? Or?
No. Not that I'm aware of, no.
So there's lots of questions, but whatever about her children, we know at least that her husband, Edward Gunning, was still alive and living in Templemore, in fact up to 1856. His address in Jail Street and occupation are further confirmed by a number of records that survive up to that date, as Jim Tobin from the Templemore Historical Society explains.
Yeah, they're mentioned in the Slater's Commercial Directory of Ireland, 1846. His occupation is a plumber and glazier. He's also mentioned in the Slater's Directory of Ireland, 1856. His Jail Street and plumber and glazier and painter.
Okay, and what's the last record then?
His Griffith's Valuation of Ireland, printed 1850, Templemore, County Tipperary. Edward Gunning, Tipperary, North Riding, Templemore.
And his full address is given there?
Kiltenan is just out the road here, yeah. It is only a quarter mile out the road.
It's intriguing that Edward Gunning doesn't appear to have been a suspect in the murder of James Short at all. Indeed, during the trial, he's only mentioned in passing, with Michael Greatrix saying that on the morning of the murder, he was away in Nina at the Petty Session Court to either, interestingly, prevent the deceased from being prosecuted for an assault, or else to swear information about the breaking of the windows. There's no church record that survives to confirm when he and Margaret married, but there are baptismal records which do confirm the number of children they had, together with their names. The newspapers of the time were correct. The Gunnings had 7 children, as it turns out all born between 1822 and 1831. Their names were Joanna, Elizabeth, then a second Elizabeth, which meant that the older child of the same name had died. Next Mary, a second Joanna, meaning again that the older child of the same name died. William, and finally James in 1831. He was the baby who had been with his mother in the jail before her execution. The newspapers say that only 4 children were alive by 1832 when Margaret was hanged, meaning that 1 more had died in the meantime. It was mentioned during the trial, and it's worth remembering that these children, naturally enough, all slept in the Gunning house the night of the murder. Interestingly, each one of the 7 baptismal records lists Margaret's maiden name, which in fact was Lyons. A search for a likely baptismal record for her proved inconclusive, although her mother and a number of sisters survived her. But what became of Edward Gunning and his 4 little children after 1832? First of all, Edward. Well, church records tell us that he wasn't a widower for very long.
He remarried 4 months afterwards, September 1832. He married Julianne Campion. Now, you might say, again, it looks maybe slightly unusual to marry so quickly, but this wasn't quite so unusual at the time, because here was a man with a large family of young children, and to have somebody, I suppose, to take care of them, to rear them, the normal thing at the time very often was for a man to remarry, and remarry as quickly as possible.
Edward and his new wife seemingly had no children, and we already know that records prove that by 1856 he was still living in Jail Street, Templemore, where he's listed as a plumber, painter and glazier. I mentioned earlier that he doesn't appear to have been a suspect in the murder of James Short. The Petty Session Court registers for Templemore, however, show that he did end up on the wrong side of the law, albeit for lesser offences, on no less than 4 occasions between 1852 and 1858. In 1852, he was in trouble for allowing clothes of his to be spread on a hedge on the side of the public road. In 1853, he was before the court for dung on the street. In 1855, for being drunk on the street in Templemore, and in 1858 for having a pig on the street. But what became of him? A later directory entitled Slater's Commercial Directory of Ireland 1870 lists him as still living at the same address and involved in the same occupation. But from then on, his circumstances spiralled into dramatic decline. His death record shows that he ended his days not in Templemore, but in the Thurles workhouse.
My name is George Willoughby. I'm the curator of St Mary's Famine Museum here in Thurles, County Tipperary.
What kind of information do we get from that record?
Well, we get very little, except that he lived to be a ripe old age. He died on the 7th of April, 1877. He was aged 90, and his occupation is shown as a tin worker. The information provided on this civil death record would have been based on what was told by somebody else. So while it would appear that they had very little information on his background, there was an informant, a householder, who knew him and identified him, probably identified the body.
Do we know what he died of? I know he was 90, so it was probably old age. But
old age, the record maintains. Cause of death, old age.
Now, just tell me a bit about the workhouse. Like, why would he have been in there? Can we speculate about that?
Well, again, in his particular case, we don't really know, but we can make certain assumptions. One is that he's named as a tin worker. Now, tin worker could be a tinsmith, it could be a tinker, but the chances were that most of these people who were involved in tin making travelled around and about an area, hopefully trying to sell some of their produce, as in tin mugs and varying other implements that are used to scoop liquid. And the chances are he may have been picked up as being a vagrant and ended up in the workhouse, as many people did, if they couldn't show any sign of how they were making a living, and if they were hungry, they were picked up and they would be forced into the workhouse. Certainly at this stage, if we knew exactly what year he had been brought in.
A check of the Thurles Workhouse Admissions Register shows that Edward Gunning was admitted on March 13th, 1877, which was less than a month before his death. He was described as badly clad and was given a coffin 6 feet long.
It was to be as a last resort. The Thurles Workhouse was built to accommodate 700 initially, but by 1847, or Black 47, they were up to possibly 3,500. Now, they weren't all in the Thurles Workhouse. They were in other buildings right around the town, like the railway station. There was a house out the Holy Cross Road which accommodated more of them.
But they were all poor people, weren't they?
These were destitute. Totally destitute.
And what kind of an existence would he have had within the workhouse? I mean, would he have been confined to the workhouse, or could he have gone into town? Or?
It's unlikely that he would have been allowed into town. Once you went in there, and once it was agreed that you couldn't afford to be outside the workhouse, you stayed there. In the very early days, all children, for example, over 14, they couldn't be released before they were 14 years of age. Most of the people in there ended up with jobs like breaking bones to manufacture fertilizer. They picked fibres from old rope to make caulking for sailing ships. In those days, you mixed tar with the fibre and it fitted in between the planks. And then there were the huge scandals. Father Barry, who wrote a book, My Life in an Irish Workhouse, told many harrowing tales of conditions there, and conditions in relation to the actual farmers who, during the harvest period, were allowed to take these men to work on their farms in return for just their dinner. There was no payment. But at the same time, it would have taken quite a hefty burden off the taxpayer.
There would have been men, women and children in the workhouse, wouldn't there?
Yes, men, women and children. Quite a large amount of children. But a lot of these, particularly in the English workhouses, were being picked up off the streets without any... They didn't appear to have any form of parental care.
The food in the workhouse would have been awful, I'd say, would it?
The food in the workhouse was desperate, yes. The diet in the workhouse was very plain and poor. Breakfast consisted of 8 ounces of oatmeal made into a stirabout and 1 pint of mixed milk. Now, by mixed milk was usually half milk, half water. For dinner, it was 3.5 pounds of potato and 1 pint of buttermilk. And that was just the records that we have in the Hospital of the Assumption, then known as the workhouse here in Thurles.
Interestingly, both the admissions register and his death record list Edward Gunning's status as married. Does this mean that his second wife, Judith Campion, was still alive when he was in there? Well, in fact it does. Her death record shows that she died almost a year after him, aged 70, in February 1878, also in Thurles Workhouse. Her occupation is given as labourer, and the cause of death is old age.
It's estimated accurately, I would imagine, that about 1/3 of all persons entering the workhouse died mainly from typhus. Very little, just a bare memorial wall now stands to mark where the old workhouse or poorhouse once stood.
But it's on the site of the hospital, is it?
The new residential area is built completely on exactly the same spot. And the old graveyard, which probably he's buried in, is still to the rear, and there's a new memorial there which was put there about 5 years ago. Now stands marking the area. There are no headstones and indeed no grave markers. Quite a number of bodies were discovered when they were researching the area before any new building took place. But yes, there are a lot of people buried there. Nobody knows how many. Unlike, say, Callan Workhouse, which would have numbered its grave markers, Thurles had no number on theirs whatsoever.
Now to investigate what became of Margaret Gunning's children after she was executed in June 1832. We know that she gave birth to 7 children between 1822 and 1831, and that newspapers of the time mention only 4 as living at the time of her death. But what could have led to 3 of her children dying before she went to the gallows? Can we speculate?
It's quite possible that in those days, practically any disease that you caught, it would certainly cause major ill health. And so you had epidemics of measles, yellow fever, you had typhus, and of course there's no cure.
We have seen from baptismal records that 2 of the children who didn't survive were named Joanna and Elizabeth, and that subsequent daughters were given the same name. My research suggests that the 3rd child to die before Margaret's death in June 1832 was a son named William. Although there's no death record, I say him as he's the only one I haven't been able to definitively trace. So to sum up, when Margaret Gunning died in June 1832, the 4 surviving children were Elizabeth, Mary, Joanna and James the youngest. In the years to come, they could easily have been put into a workhouse, succumbed to disease, starvation, death or immigration during the famine, or even died young before any of that was possible, like their 3 siblings. In fact, they didn't. and I have been able to unearth trinklets of information about them by focusing primarily on Irish records. The oldest, Elizabeth Gunning, who was baptised in Templemore in 1825, married a Morgan Prendergast in the town in 1843. They went on to have 7 children and lived in Clonmore, Templemore. There is no year of death recorded, but she's buried in the parish of Killea, County Tipperary, which is 5 kilometres from Templemore. The next child, Mary Gunning, was baptised in Templemore in 1826 and in 1851 married a soldier from the 81st Regiment named Benjamin Smith in the town in a Church of Ireland ceremony. Her father, Edward, actually stood as a witness at the wedding. Mary and Benjamin Smith had 5 children. Actually, only the first was born in Templemore, that being Edward in 1852, whom she named after her father, who acted as godfather at the baptism. Mary remained a Catholic. By 1854, they were living in Loughrea, County Galway, where she gave birth to the other 4 children. By now, her husband worked as a shopkeeper and farmer. The next child was Joanna Gunning, and she was baptised in Templemore in 1827. Like her older sister, she also married a soldier there in 1842. It was a Church of Ireland wedding, and once again Edward Gunning acted as a witness. Her husband's name was Abraham Pilkington. Finally, James Gunning, it will be recalled, was the baby that had spent time in prison with his mother in the lead up to her execution. He had been baptised in October 1831 in Templemore. The next we hear of him is in 1852 in the Petty Session Court Registers for Templemore. In fact, he's recorded as living and working as a tin worker there. He's accused of willful trespass on another man's wheat. The only marriage record for James Gunning is in 1858 to an Anne Ryan in Newport, County Tipperary. I could find no record of death, and he's not in the census. It's clear that more in-depth research is required on the Gunning children. One can only imagine what impact their mother's gruesome death and the negative connotations associated with the murder of James Short had on them, and indeed their father, throughout their lives.
Even though James Cormac was tried for the murder, was hanged for the murder, nobody actually saw him do the murder, which again might suggest that today that the evidence, even in his case, was more circumstantial than real.
Margaret Gunning, in this case, she does seem to be part of the modern trial process in the sense that she was represented by a lawyer. It seems in general that the rules of evidence and the criminal law rules seem to be complied with, but they wouldn't have been as strictly adhered to as we would know them today.
I have no doubt whatsoever that if Margaret Gunning was being tried in the courts today, that she would not actually be convicted because, as I said, the evidence of the stick, the witness against her. And of course, one of the problems at the time as well was that the defendant was not allowed to give evidence themselves on their own behalf. Really, there was nothing but a certain amount of circumstantial evidence against her.
And so what capital executions permitted the authority to do was to send a message to the community at large. So it wasn't designed to catch everybody and punish everybody. It was designed to catch a few, and then the intensity of that was to be seen by all.
She was a married woman, she had 4 children. She protested her innocence, of course, and she was hanged. It was a very sad case, really.